The thing I would say is, when you grow up, you tend to get told that the world is the way it is, and your life is just to live your life inside the world. Try not to bash into the walls too much. Try to have a nice family life. Have fun. Save a little money. Um, but that's a very limited life. Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. You can build your own things that other people can use. And the minute that you understand that you can poke life and actually something will, if you push in, something will pop out the other side, that you can change it, you can mold it. That's maybe the most important thing, is to shake off this erroneous notion that life is there and you're just going to live in it, versus embrace it, change it, improve it, make your mark upon it. I think that's very important. And however you learn that, once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better, because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.
So Steve Jobs held this idea in his head that effectively he was able to control and manipulate the world around him and bend it to his will. And this was a kind of mystical charisma that he was able to use to bend the perception of those around him. So his colleagues, his confidants, and his friends. Often this could be a tool he would use to avoid confronting the realities of life, such as when he ignored his birth daughter, Lisa, for the first few years of her life, refusing to engage in reality and thus bending it to his own will. Other times he would use the reality distortion field to inspire and motivate his colleagues to finish a product on time. For this reason, some people saw him as a genius inspirer and others as a manipulative tyrant, and also quite childlike. As you've seen in the clip prior, he really held this view that he was able to completely change the fabric of the universe around him, which was potentially a reason as to why he could, or definitely was a reason as to why he could. So the purpose of this is to explore how he used the reality distortion field through the arc of his life, from searching for his own identity to how he dealt with his diagnosis with cancer and his death. So we'll be looking at this from multiple different lenses: psychological, philosophical, as well as personal. And then also kind of connected to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, and ultimately come to a conclusion on whether or not he was closer to that Nietzsche sort of idea of a Superman bending reality to his will and constructing the world around him to fit his own worldview, or was it actually a personal crux that led Jobs to lots of personal unhappiness and eventually actually to his demise? So the main comparison that this exploration will kind of link Jobs' attitude to is the Übermensch. So Friedrich Nietzsche's concept, the Übermensch, which is translated as Overman or Superman, emerged most prominently in his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a bit more complicated than just a simple notion of being superhuman in terms of intellect or even strength. It's about an individual who is able to forge new values and meanings beyond the constraints of traditional morality or societal norms or a religious doctrine. So he believed that humanity was in a transitional state. And the quote is, "A rope stretched between beast and overman, that through self-overcoming and creative willpower, exceptional individuals would be able to elevate themselves to a higher plane of existence." Importantly, as well as creating themselves, these individuals would create the world around them. And you can really see this with Jobs, in that he was undoubtedly quite a visionary in terms of his ability to come up with new products and new ways in which the world would operate. The world prior to Jobs is pretty unrecognizable in terms of engagement with technology in everyday life. Jobs he didn't really resonate with the works of Nietzsche, and he would opt for Far Eastern philosophy instead. But it is useful to kind of think that this concept is really how Jobs perceived himself. He perceived himself as one of these individuals that was really able to master himself and master the art of creation. So what we're kind of doing is going through Jobs' life, and each stage, you can make these observations about how he was able to use his own aura to warp reality around him, all the way from his childhood in California, in Mountain View, to Reed College, which he only attended for 6 months, and then stayed on campus, from working at Atari, and to eventually beginning Apple at 20 years old, then getting kicked off the board of Apple, and venturing into his own endeavors at Next, and then also in investing in Pixar, and then finally back to Apple, where he sort of becomes an absolute legend and he uses all of this previous experience to completely change the world. I personally think that the story of Steve Jobs is just one of the best sort of stories of any individual you can actually go and read about, because it's just got so many twists and turns, and he's just such an interesting character. And I think if you want to go and read a very good sort of source on his life, that would have to be the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs, because it's just absolutely brilliant. So, Steve Jobs entered the world unwilling to accept it at face value. He was born in 1955 and adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. He sort of grows up brilliant and brash in Silicon Valley's nascent tech scene. Steve was generally content with his adoption, according to most accounts. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with his adopted mother and father, who, in the Isaacson novel, he explains to be nothing more than an egg and sperm bank, which is not a particularly considerate way of explaining it, but that was just what Steve was like. So he often spoke candidly about his adoption and stressed that he felt chosen by his adopted parents, Paul and Clara Jobs. One childhood anecdote from Steve recounts how a neighborhood girl teased him for being abandoned and prompted Jobs to rush home in tears. His parents then reassured him and empathetically explained that they'd specifically picked him out and that he was special. And that story really stuck with Jobs, and he would use it to kind of explain his position on being adopted. He dismissed the kind of idea that his endeavors were basically a childhood premonition of a repressed desire to impress his biological parents so they would take him back or anything like that. So he was quite self-aware in how his ambition could look regarding his adoption. On the contrary, over the years, his friends and colleagues sort of noticed that the narrative of being chosen really helped him develop this self-belief that was a little bit mad and a little bit reality distorting. Andy Hertzfeld, who was an original member of the Macintosh team, recalled that Jobs' confidence in his destiny was unshakable, as if, and this is Hertzfeld's quote, he always knew he had something to prove.
Jobs used the idea that he believed that he was going to die young as a reason to create a sense of urgency about creating great products. And he has a brilliant line in his 2005 Stanford speech where he talks about your life as a rainbow, and you appear and then you get this chance to blaze brilliantly in the sky, and then you disappear again, which is completely in line with how he lived his life, completely believing throughout his younger years that he was going to die early. And so you really got this sense with the different projects that he involved himself in, that there was always this need to get stuff done very quickly.
So, similarly, various Apple insiders kind of noted that Jobs rarely dwelled on his adoption in conversation. So, this idea of him being set apart was powerful to his intense drive and his often quite abrasive self-assurance. However, you kind of have to bear in mind that at the surface level, this is all speculation, and you can't really trust that Jobs was being completely honest with Isaacson when he made these comments. And there was only really one man who knew how the adoption affected him, and that was Steve himself. He had a tendency in the Isaacson book to which Isaacson picked up on, to kind of brush around certain issues, specifically his guilt around kind of abandoning his daughter, Lisa, and things like that. So you can't really take his word as gospel. There is kind of an argument to be made, which I quite like, that this kind of explores, is that the Reality Distortion Field was basically a childlike attempt to control the bounds of the cold and harsh universe around him that had rejected him at birth. So this kind of attitude that he had was reflected in his emotional outbursts, his insane dietary habits, and his desire for absolute control in his relationships. Which kind of reflects a bit of an internal angst about stuff in his life that he wasn't able to directly influence. And again, at Apple, there were many conflicts, particularly working on the Lisa model, where his level of control over the project sort of concerned the board, and eventually they decided to move him on from the project because he was so specific about minute details. And again, this sort of forms part of his philosophy about products that he learned from his father, Paul Jobs, that effectively you should consider the elements of design that don't meet the eye. So the internal circuitries looking elegant and beautiful were very important to him, even though the Apple products were designed so that you couldn't open them up. Anyway, these kind of obsessions that he would sort of hold his design team to account on were another sort of reflection of this kind of desire for control that he held. So as Steve refined his vision for Apple, his obsession with controlling the user experience became increasingly evident as well. So not just the product design, but how people interacted with the technology itself. Steve with Wozniak came from a hobbyist background, and there was an open source ethos behind early computing, which kind of encouraged the end user to explore the technology and modify it, whereas Jobs engineered a closed, tightly curated digital world and ensured that those who used Apple products used them exactly as he intended. So, for example, the Macintosh made hardware modifications very difficult. The Apple II had 8 ports, whereas the Macintosh only had 2, I believe. And then the iPod only worked with Apple's own software. This was kind of a belief he held about all of their products. Even when he went to go and work at Next, he wanted the same thing, but due to slumping sales, had to sort of relent on this idea. When the iPhone came out, he introduced the App Store's walled garden, where every app had to pass through Apple's very stringent approval process. So yeah, it wasn't just about the elegance of the design and fitting in with the Bauhaus movement. It was about dictating the terms of engagement. So what software could run, what repairs could be made, and how people conceptualized the technology that they used. So former Apple engineer Tony Fadell remarked that Jobs believed that users, quote, shouldn't have to think, end quote. They should simply trust Apple to provide the best experience. The relentless drive that Jobs held to orchestrate and curate every aspect of interaction might be said to have reflected his deeper need to shape reality, ensuring that even the most mundane digital interactions conform to his vision. So yeah, he didn't just control the hardware and the products themselves. He controlled how the user was able to utilize them, and therefore controlled the very way that people engage with technology and bended user behavior to his will as much as he bent markets and industries, continuing to utilize his reality distortion field. It may actually be the case that his desire for control of the world around him made him change it, and sort of he did. I mean, he completely changed the way in which we live our lives. We spend an average of about 4 hours a day on our mobile devices, and that doesn't even take into account the computers, so the personal desktop computers that we all use to work on, which has just completely transformed the world. So, as a boy, he was kind of precocious in his defiance of authority and his fascination with electronics. So his father, Paul, taught him craftsmanship. And this is a quote from Paul. "When you're a carpenter making a beautiful chest of drawers, you're not going to use a piece of plywood on the back. For you to sleep well at night, the aesthetic, the quality, has to be carried all the way through." I mean, this is just a very good quote for understanding Steve, as previously sort of explained. But, yeah, essentially he's a very rebellious child. He struggled in school, all that classic sort of, classic origin story kind of most successful people. So there's a lot to talk about for his childhood, particularly his interest in electronics, his friendship with Steve Wozniak. There's an incident when he was about 12, and he called up Hewlett-Packard to ask for parts, and the receiver of the call was so impressed that they offered him a job for the summer. And yeah, there's quite a lot to talk about there, but in terms of the focus of this, so the reality distortion field, it's kind of important to move on to his teen years, where he begins to sort of move on to philosophy, literature, and mysticism. So he was a voracious reader, Shakespeare, to Zen mind, beginner's mind, and sort of wanted to seek some what he perceived to be deeper truths beyond the material world. And this is where it really begins to kind of dawn on him that most of the world around him was merely perception. He'd also experimented in a bit of psychedelic drugs, like LSD. And his quote on LSD is, "LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things instead of making money." And Steve would go on to have quite a strange attitude towards material possessions, money, wealth, because in some sense that was kind of true. He didn't really... There was no point in his career where you could really say he was focused on just making as much money as possible. He was really one of these people who wanted to change the world with a product. This sort of like romantic idea that he could change the world was very important to him. Jobs kind of said that LSD expanded his consciousness, and he'd often sort of take digs at other people who didn't take LSD for being quite narrow. Famously, Bill Gates, who he didn't really get along very well with. He had a bit of a weird relationship with Bill Gates because they were sort of friends by the end. But yeah, so he I think he said about Gates that he'd be a much broader guy if he'd just taken a bit of LSD. All this to sort of serve the idea where his consciousness could be fluid and remade by his own vision and will. So then, I mean, there's so much to go through. We're just sort of speeding through it. But so if we move on to Reed College, where he decides to go to, as quite a sort of artistic hippie movement college. He goes there at age 17 and only lasts one formal semester before he drops out, on the basis that he didn't want to waste his parents' money, who'd scrimped and saved to get him there, because he couldn't really see the point of it, and he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life. So he sticks around, sort of moping about campus, staying on the floor of one of his friends, and collecting Coca-Cola bottles and returning them for 5 cents a piece so that he could eat. So not a particularly glamorous lifestyle, but quite free, quite fun. And the dean of Reed College actually knew about this and allowed him to stay there. And Jobs would go on to say that everything he learned about being generous, he learned from the dean of Reed College, Jack Dudman. And yeah, so he's very much sort of ingrained in this 1970s hippie culture, in a sort of bohemian universe with artist, intellectual types and spiritual seekers. Here it's really important that Jobs met Robert Friedland. Now, Jobs at this point is the kind of antithesis of the way that we perceive him. He's not shy, but he's a bit reserved and lacking in self-confidence. And he meets this guy called Robert Friedland, who is a charismatic older student, about 5 years or so older than Jobs, who became his kind of mentor in persuading those around him through charisma and selling ideas to people. So the way they met becomes has become sort of urban legend, where Jobs knocks on his door, on his dorm room door, to sell him a typewriter, only to interrupt Friedland having sex with his girlfriend. Friedland's girlfriend, that is. And Friedland is just completely unfazed and invites Jobs in and asks him to wait until he's finished, which was quite the first impression that began a very unusual friendship. Friedland was gregarious, intensely charismatic, according to Jobs, and politically quite savvy, and even a former commune leader. He'd spent time in prison for LSD use and emerged quite a magnetic and charismatic figure, and soon won an election as Reed's student body president. So under Friedland's wing, Jobs sort of became charismatic himself and discovered how to use charisma as a weapon. So Friedland acted as a sort of persuasion mentor to Jobs, and is the person many credit with inspiring Jobs' infamous Reality Distortion Field. And that's according to an article called Sex, Drugs and Reality Distortion and Capitalist Exploits. So it was Reed from who Steve learned the Reality Distortion Field, as Walter Isaacson put it. So in this period, he sort of seems to be undergoing what he refers to as a bit of a spiritual awakening that gives quite philosophical underpinnings to his Reality Distortion Field that he's in the process of developing. He audited classes in Zen Buddhism, and calligraphy. And from calligraphy in particular, he really sort of it resonates with him, and he'll go on to really push the idea of including fonts in the Macintosh, because calligraphy sticks as a way of conveying sort of beauty to Jobs. So on this kind of journey of his, he and Friedland trekked to India, and trekked through India and visited ashrams and gurus in search of enlightenment. And it's said that he was stripped of his material illusions, which is quite a strange sort of contradiction, in that his entire world after this was about creating products of desire, of material desire. One sort of paradox that he would come to resent when he discussed it with anyone from this point forward. So one really interesting concept is in India the concept of Maya, or Maya, which is the world as an illusion. And Jobs really sort of drank deeply from that well of thought, as it's said. If reality was in truth an illusion, why wouldn't you just create a better one? And I recently listened to a podcast where a therapist talks with Andrew Tate, and it seems that he uses this kind of strange model of mental thinking where he says that he's able to not be depressed because he doesn't believe in it. And I just thought that was a kind of similar thing. Why, if your perception is just an illusion, why don't you perceive things to be better than they are? Anyway, moving on. Essentially, so through his college years, he starts to cultivate this persona with a strange amount of confidence. He also begins to dabble in very strange practices of long periods of fasting, extreme diets, even at one point just apples and carrots, which he believed would discipline his body and his perception and allow him to unlock a different level of consciousness, which very much aligns with this Übermensch discipline, where you transcend the ordinary limits of the mind and body. His classmates at Reed sort of very similarly to his Apple colleagues, recalled him as magnetic and maddening. He was a kind of barefoot, unwashed vegan man who spoke of cosmic consciousness at one moment, and then would just go on to persuade you of absurd things in the next. So very persuasive, very charismatic, and it seems that he really develops this under Friedland. So by the time he'd left Reed, he'd forged two very key components of the reality distortion field, which were an unshakable personal conviction and a very charismatic style of communication that he'd go on to wow board members, fellow employees, and customers with, and make them really believe in what he was talking about, even though quite a lot of the time it was absolute nonsense. And he was wrong a lot, is what people forget about Jobs. He was wrong about Next Computer, for example. But people would still buy in to his ideas because he was such a charismatic talker. So he learned that if he believed something fervently enough, he could then project that belief onto others and sort of bring them into his sense of certainty. So now we'll move on to Atari. So in 1974, a very confident Jobs wanders into Atari and basically demands a job. He was 19 at this point. He walks in barefoot. He's a very countercultural looking man with long hair, quite smelly, as he believed that his strict vegan diet removed the necessity to shower. So you can imagine what he would kind of look like. You'd probably be calling security quite quickly at this point. But no, Atari's founder Nolan Bushnell, who himself, or considered himself to be, quite a charismatic visionary, saw something of himself in this strange-looking man, young man who'd walked into his office, and gets offered a job, even though he has no formal engineering qualifications. And this is quite an early example of him using his reality distortion field to get himself a job, which is quite nice for him. So he famously refused to shower and antagonizes co-workers with his strange hippie habits, which he tried to push on them and recommended that they all eat vegan. And if they decided to eat foods that involved cholesterol, would warn them of how soon this sort of thing would affect them. And so he was quite an annoying guy, basically. So for this, Atari's management decide to relegate him to the night shift so that there's no conflict. So they obviously see some potential in him, but also realise that he was quite annoying to the other co-workers. And to sort of accommodate this, they moved him to the night shift. So he'd often finagle his buddy, Steve Wozniak, who was a brilliant engineer. Unlike Steve, really, Steve was quite a mediocre engineer. He was just very, very charismatic. Steve Wozniak, who's a great engineer and his future Apple co-founder, to help him build a new game called Breakout under an impossibly tight deadline. Jobs sort of used the opportunity to promise Atari an absurdly efficient design. And so Atari responded and said that he would receive a bonus on top of the original $5,000 reward for creating the game. A bonus for each chip under 50 chips that could be used. And sort of famously, Steve did not mention this to Wozniak, who he was almost entirely reliant on to build the game, and did not mention the bonus at all, which became a sort of sticky point between the two of them. And as they were both interviewed about it, Steve claimed genuinely that he couldn't remember if there was a bonus, and that if there was, he would have shared it with Wozniak.
And Wozniak kind of believed that there was a bonus, and that Steve, at that point, was being a little bit sneaky. But anyway, this is another example, I suppose, of distorting reality, because on the face of it, he was not able to build this game in the deadline, which was 4 days. But he gets his buddy, Steve Wozniak, brilliant engineer, to stay up with him for 4 days and build this game, and they're successful. And yeah, so that example sort of shows the kind of weird friendship that Wozniak and Jobs held, and this example kind of come to represent a lot of their later squabbles. And yeah, how Jobs, when faced with an impossible task, would sort of pull one out the bag and reinforce this idea, particularly concerning deadlines, that he could just do whatever he put his mind to, which was a bit insane. And Wozniak even initially sort of suggests that designing the game in a few days with minimal chips was illogical, but Jobs kind of insists to him that it could be done, and so should be done. And so Woz says about Jobs in relation to the reality distortion field, he goes, Jobs' reality distortion is when he has an illogical vision of the future. You realize that it can't be true, but he somehow makes it true. And that comes from Steve Jobs' Reality Distortion Field, Leadership or Bullying on Changing Winds. So, fueled by Steve's relentless push, Wozniak sort of pulls off this ridiculous engineering feat in 4 days that kind of stuns Atari. And yeah, it's one of these early examples. Yeah, so that the dispute over the betrayal in terms of the bonus becomes a bit of a void between the two of them, and showed that his reality distortion field could kind of veer into manipulation and selfishness. And Wozniak was quite a gentle soul and forgave Jobs about it, and sort of chalked it up to youthful folly. But his sort of behavioural pattern from this point onwards was set, and his kind of complex that the normal rules didn't apply to him was completely in full effect at this point. And as the Atari example demonstrates, he was able to walk himself into roles far beyond his credentials and convince other engineers to spare him parts for free. So yeah, he was at this point kind of testing the limits of his powers, and sometimes quite irresponsibly, as shown by the dispute with Wozniak. I think what's really interesting to bear in mind about his job at Atari was that it was pretty critical to his overall character that he eventually came to be, and kind of learned that in industry, his boldness and persuasion would often carry him far further than his formal or any formal qualifications. So that breakout project was his first small victory of bending reality, and also his first moral compromise, which becomes quite an interesting insight into the way he conducted himself later at Apple. So there was a duality to this reality distortion field, in that it inspired extraordinary levels of effort, but also bred this kind of recklessness and disregard for the truth. So then we move on to the beginning of Apple Computer. So Apple Computer was born in a Los Altos garage in 1976. Steve was just 21 when Apple was incorporated, and cast himself as a visionary out to make a dent in the universe, in his own words. He sort of had this consummate skill at persuasion and salesmanship that awed some and would alarm others. But to the outside world, Jobs would sell a dream like no one else. Inside Apple, his presence was electrifying and often terrifying. Employees would come to describe working with Steve as either the best experience of your life or the worst, with very little in between. And he had this famous assessment of the people that he would work with as either gods or shitheads. And let's just say he didn't want to be a shithead. So Bud Tribble, who was a software engineer on the Macintosh project, was the first to famously dub Steve's charisma a reality distortion field. And he actually borrowed the term from a Star Trek episode where aliens are able to create their own reality by mental force. So Tribble joked, half admiring and half frustrated, that in Jobs' presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. It wears off when he's not around. And so you get a lot of these stories of Steve reviewing products and suggesting changes in the room where his fellow employees would go, yeah, no, that sounds like a great idea. We can do that. That's brilliant. And then as soon as he was to leave the room, they go, oh, what the hell were we thinking? This is a case at Apple, at Next, at Pixar. So this was said in 1981, Tribble's quote, when Jobs was trying to push the Mac team to achieve the impossible in terms of engineering feats in insane or under insane deadlines. So there was one new recruit who heard Steve's unrealistic deadline for the Mac completion and balked. And Tribble warned him that logic holds no power against Steve's field. So sure enough, under Jobs' spell, the team delivered the Macintosh on a timeline no sane manager would have accepted. And so the order of, and I've sort of skipped over the progression of Apple, but essentially Wozniak builds the Apple One, which is quite a light success. And then the Apple II is where Apple really takes off, also designed by Wozniak. And so after some pretty tremendous growth, they become a Fortune 500 company 7 years after inception. But around 1981, Jobs is pushing to build the Macintosh, which is a sort of amalgamation of all the development in the world of personal computing and a really sort of audacious attempt to build a kind of incredible product that changes the world. So going back to Jobs' Reality Distortion Field, on the positive side, it led to breakthrough products. So the Apple II was a product of Jobs' insistence on simplicity and elegance. And this became the first mass market personal computer, which was truly a reality bending idea at the time. The Macintosh project saw Jobs demanding that the GUI interface responded fluidly and looked beautiful, far beyond the state of the art. Engineers who worked with Jobs recount that how when told a task was impossible, Jobs would refuse to accept it and sort of say, well, this is a direct quote, no, it is possible, do it, and then walk away. So, yeah, after some furious anger from Jobs, the team would kind of be able to find a way, and in a sort of sense that they wouldn't have had Jobs not been such a persistent sort of character. One manager recalled, he would shout at a meeting, "You idiot, you never do anything right. Yet I consider myself the absolute luckiest person in the world to have worked for him." So why does this guy consider himself lucky? Because as painful as Jobs' methods were, he pushed them to produce what they far beyond what they thought was possible. Under the Reality Distortion Field, sleep was pretty much optional. Excellence was mandatory, and engineering miracles were basically routine. Jobs would, and this is paraphrasing, but would essentially say that people weren't used to working in an environment where excellence was expected. And the Mac team famously made some quite tongue-in-cheek t-shirts that read 90 hours a week and loving it, which was probably a fair reflection of how it was to work under Jobs. So Jobs also often said that work and life were indistinguishable for him. This sort of changed a bit as he got older and became kind of 90% work, but he honestly could not separate the two things, as his work was his life. In terms of his leadership, he was a bit of a paradox. He didn't follow any kind of textbook advice. Instead, sort of broke people down and challenged their core. And in many cases, actually allowed them or facilitated them achieving things they themselves thought impossible, but violating sort of many codes of professionalism in the workplace to do this. So, in this sense, Jobs was pushing his Übermensch idea onto others. So, which is really interesting. He was in the business of transcending ordinary human limits, but he would strive to give life meaning to others by pushing them to exceed what came before. And so his obsession with A players at Apple to transcend the status quo and redefine the possible was kind of willing a higher form of human creativity into being. Which, yeah, is quite an interesting look into his philosophy of life. So there was quite a dark side to his transcendent drive, which was pretty impossible to ignore. By 1985, Steve Jobs had sort of become a bit of a tyrant in the eyes of many. It's said that he could be brutal on those close to him, dishing out verbal abuse regularly. Former colleagues described living in his distortion field as exhilarating, but also emotionally draining and often even dehumanizing. He dichotomized everything. And a design was either insanely great or total shit, with no middle ground. And so if something wasn't up to his standards, he didn't want it. He didn't want anything to do with it. And it perhaps is such a reason why you look at your Apple products and you think an alien must have made these, particularly around the time that they came out, like particularly the iPhone. You kind of thought, this is impossible. And that was a result of Steve's sort of thinking in this regard is black and white absolutism, which was a huge part of how he distorted his reality. And only things that met his idealistic version of the world could be a part of it. Some team members were quite smart and sort of decoded his outbursts and sort of realised they weren't actually literal insults, but challenges. So this is crap in the moment was, in Jobs speak, convince me why this is the best way or do better. So a lot of people couldn't withstand such pressure, understandably. And there was a bit of a cultish atmosphere in the Mac team, particularly as the story goes, Steve was kicked off the Lisa team, partly due to his sort of maniacal way of leadership and unrelenting standards that caused him to spend far too much money on the Lisa, And so he decided to take over the Mac team instead and fill it with his trusted engineers. And so it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that those around him believed in his vision, because the ones who didn't were gone, basically. One of the early Apple employees quipped that it was Steve's world. We were all just living in it. And Reality Distortion Field did not invite dissent. So another quote is, negotiation was out. Failure was not an option. Naysayers were turfed. So he was so convinced of his own rightness that any contrary voice was the enemy of the truth that he was determined to manifest, to bring to life. And you could see that this was a kind of ticking time bomb, or was coming to a boiling point. And so in 1985, his approach kind of met its limit. So Apple's board were alarmed by the turmoil and eventual slump in Macintosh sales. And they sided with the CEO, John Sculley, and removed Jobs from day-to-day management. His Reality Distortion Field finally collided with reality in that Steve's vision for the Mac clashed with market economics and corporate politics, and he lost. Jobs and Sculley had an interesting relationship. Sculley absolutely admired Jobs and incorrectly saw himself in Jobs. Jobs had gone out to recruit John Sculley, who was working on the advertising board at Pepsi, when Pepsi was very successful in that regard. And this was basically a climax of their relationship where they kind of turned on each other. And yeah, so to those who opposed or resisted him, Jobs became almost inhuman in his intensity towards. So he was so consumed by his own will to power that empathy would kind of fall away. And you can see this in the Isaacson book when he tries to pull a coup to get rid of Sculley the next day. Sorry, not the next day, a bit of time later. And as Sculley is away on business in China, or so he thinks, and Sculley catches wind of this and comes to the meeting. And Jobs is apparently completely cold and says to Sculley, I don't think you're right for this company. And the two had been previously friends, sort of shattered their relationship. So at this point, he is exiled from the company he founded. Jobs is 30 years old at this point, and sort of comes across this period of self-reflection where he has to really think about what he can actually achieve. So now we get to the point where Jobs has been banished from Apple. And Jobs embarks on what could be seen as his Odyssean exile, which is a decade wandering the wilds of tech and entertainment, and importantly refining his talents, and crucially his character, as he's going to have to deal with quite a lot of evidence that suggests that his Reality Distortion Field is not as concrete as he believes it to be. So in 1985, he founds Next Inc., which was determined to build a new computer that would surpass the Macintosh, but for educational purposes. So it did cool things like you were able to search through big volumes of books, and they famously came equipped with the volumes of Shakespeare. At the same time, he also purchased A small graphics division from Lucasfilm. George Lucas at the time was going through a divorce, and so had to sell off some of his assets within the company after the success of Star Wars. And he turned it into Pixar, which was quite an unlikely venture into computer animation, but it becomes more understandable when you understand that Jobs was about blending creativity and technology, and so animated movies which were rendered by powerful computers is sort of the perfect marriage of these two separate, or seemingly separate elements. So two parallel quests, one in high-end computers and one in digital animation. And this tests Jobs' reality distortion field, and he has to sort of reckon with personal failure, especially when it comes to Next. So at Next, his reality distortion field initially burned as brightly as ever. He essentially violates his contract with Apple, because he still holds a position there, although it's just for show, really, and hires some of his old Apple loyalists, to which he casts a grand vision of a sleek, superpowered workstation to revolutionize education. He was very particular, though, about this being a perfect cube, which was literally a 1-foot magnesium cube with very futuristic capabilities. He famously, very quietly, offered stake in the company to venture capitalists who couldn't really work out what the project was, and a lot of them declined. However, Texan billionaire Ross Perot was mesmerized by Steve's pitch and his charisma. Perot later said that investing in Next was easier than, quote, selling ice in the winter to Eskimos. So take from that what you will. Such was Jobs' salesmanship. Employees were also under the spell at first, so Next's corporate culture in the late 80s was a bit of an Apple redux, with all-nighters, lofty goals, and Steve imposing impossible demands upon the team. The reality distortion field was in full effect as he exhorted his team to craft the perfect machine. But reality was a little more stubborn at Next. The Next Cube, when launched in 1988, was beautiful, but highly impractical. Too expensive for the education market, too slow for business, and basically just a commercial flop, and really revealed that Jobs was human, and didn't know everything about the direction that the world was headed in terms of personal computing. Jobs convinced his team and investors to ignore the practical limitations and poured efforts into the aesthetic perfection of the product, like an insanely fast optical drive that didn't work and case materials that drove up cost. In one sense, his willpower overshot reality, and no amount of his charisma and salesmanship flair could make the world buy a $10,000 workstation that it didn't need. The original pricing point was suggested to be around $2,000 to $3,000, and there was a big upset at the unveil, as in total the workstation would cost around $10,000. So Bill Gates was famously unwilling to cooperate with Jobs and design software for the Next, and was very harsh about the product when speaking to Jobs, and they got into loads of heated arguments where Jobs would start crying, as was very typical of him. And Bill Gates remarked years later that Jobs managed to captivate people with products that ultimately failed, noting that the Next computer completely failed. It was such nonsense, and yet he mesmerized those people. So the reality distortion field was potent, but not omnipotent. It could motivate a team to create a marvel, but it could not magically ensure market success when his vision was misaligned with reality. And this sort of next experience humbled Jobs and taught him that even an Ubermensch must sometimes bend to reality and not vice versa. Jobs invested quite a lot of his own personal capital, having sold off a lot of his Apple shares when he was kicked off the project. However, Next wasn't a total loss in that its software was technically brilliant, and its concept would later form the core of the Mac OS X. In a strange twist of fate, his Reality Distortion came back to Apple, which bought Next in 1996 to save itself and brought Steve home. The product itself failed, but the ideas lived on and vindicated Steve's vision in this sense. His pattern of bold vision, initial failure, and eventual vindication shows the Reality Distortion Field's double edge. It can drive innovation years ahead of its time, but often at the cost of short-term failure and personal fallout. Jobs in this era began to temper his approach slightly, learning a bit of patience, humility, and the value of iteration. So, meanwhile at Pixar, a completely different side of Jobs emerged. Here he was not the omnipotent designer, but more of a benefactor, deal maker, and patron. Pixar's creative team, Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, had their own magic in their ability to tell stories with groundbreaking computer animation. At first, Jobs tried to run Pixar like a tech startup, trying to force some of his tech ideas on the team, but soon realised that the people at Pixar were kind of masters of a craft that he really didn't understand, and that was storytelling. He had little to show after years of funding their short films and technology, and considered selling his Pixar a few years later. His Reality Distortion Field couldn't immediately will a hit movie into existence, and he grew impatient. But by the mid-90s, Pixar struck a deal with Disney, and Jobs stepped back and let the creative geniuses do their work. Toy Story in 1995 was a smash success, and so it was also the first fully computer animated feature film, and was more of a collaborative vision, not just Steve's. But to his credit, Jobs in this sense had matured enough to let Pixar do its thing and to let the talent flourish without having to micromanage every pixel, an approach he would kind of bring to Apple in his matured state. His Reality Distortion Field still helped when needed, so for instance he negotiated a fantastic deal for Pixar's IPO and spun the story of the future of entertainment to Wall Street with very Jobsian hype that he was able to do for the next computer, for the Macintosh, and for the Apple II. He became a billionaire overnight. But within Pixar's Emeryville halls, he was known to be gentler than at Apple, even fatherly. I think he really respects art, and so regarded Pixar's creators as great artists, and so was quite deferential to them. Animators at Pixar recall him laughing and crying at story pitches, encouraging them to make it great, but not eviscerating them, as he would have done in his younger years. His exile was shown to have softened him quite a bit and sort of injected him with a dose of humility. Facing failure and limitations at Next as well had the same effect, and he started evolving from a brash Ubermensch to something more complex, a bit more of a leader who was able to warp reality but also recognize his limits and the values of others' contributions. This period probably taught Jobs a lot about balance, and a kind of Aristotelian moderation, which crept into a previously very all or nothing persona. He also learned a bit of Socratic wisdom: know thyself, particularly when you know you need others. And he was previously very good at recognizing talent and garnering talent for his team, but he now sort of knew when to step back and let others do their thing. So this moderation would kind of set the stage for his return, his triumphant return at Apple.
I think one other point I wanted to talk about was also from Jobs' 2005 Stanford speech, where he essentially explained that you need to turn your own life into a story, and that will help you to make decisions. If you can think that at the end of my life I will be able to look back at it as a story with different characters, different goods and evils, and famously, for example, in his picturing of the IBM versus Apple dichotomy in the famous 1984 commercial directed by Ridley Scott, where IBM were depicted as Big Brother, or the equivalent, and Apple as the great saviors that would liberate personal computing. So, yeah, he would always kind of villainize anything that wasn't according to his own plan. So there was a lot of this internally at Apple, which eventually led to him being kicked out, which was probably fair in retrospect. So when he was booted off the Lisa team at launch events for the Lisa, he made it clear that the Macintosh would be coming out soon and that it would be a cheaper version of the Lisa with more hype around it, and definitely sought some form of retribution against the Lisa team for getting rid of him, or more so the board of directors at Apple for getting rid of him on the Lisa team. He also made the Macintosh incompatible with the Lisa, which was just another way of him kind of having a dig at the Lisa team. And this was kind of Jobs' way of painting himself in as the good against the evil, both in the sense that Apple would fight IBM to liberate personal computing, and that Jobs would fight for a position within Apple to ensure that his vision with the Mac took priority. But the overall idea of turning your own life into a story with characters that are both good and evil is quite an interesting concept, because Steve Jobs' life is probably the most interesting story that anyone could have, and gets you to kind of think about the decisions that you make and why you make them. So that'll be the end of part 1 on Steve Jobs and the Reality Distortion Field. In the next part, we'll look at his return to Apple and how he kind of used his matured skills to change the trajectory of Apple and change the digital world around him.